another one that I've wanted to do for a while, a very long time actually. I lost I'm probably going to cry.
Oh.
I lost my mother back in 2012, and she died to cancer. You know, and I'm not unique. I mean, I'm sure there's any number of people here who have lost loved ones to cancer. I'm battling cancer at the moment. It's a terrible disease. If you haven't cared for somebody you love who's dying with cancer, I hope you never do. I hope you never have to. So this is a panel that's really important to me because my mother was my best friend, and I know so many of us have lost friends and family to this horrible disease. So I wanted to do this panel because I wanted it to be uplifting, not that cancer is uplifting, but the fight and the hope is what is uplifting. And then we had the pre-call. And
we found hope. Don't worry.
there will be
We've talked.
Hope. The hope is the science. The hope are the good people who are trying to eradicate this horrible disease that we know, based on the cures that are coming out, can be eradicated one day. And then we have, unfortunately, our policymakers who seem to be trying to make that a bit more difficult. So against the good news from the scientific front, we have some iffy news or bad news or disappointing news from the IP policy front. And we're going to talk about all of those things here today in this segment, which is going to be a bit of a different type of segment for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panel again from your left to right, and I'm going to ask them to give their initial thoughts on this matter. And then I'm going to queue up a video that we can play, and then we'll have a discussion. So we have Dan Young, all the way to the left, who is a shareholder on the biotechnology practice group at Wolf Greenfield. Thank you very much for coming down from Boston, Dan. Also from Boston is Hillary Libka, who is the Chief IP Counsel and Associate General Counsel of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And last but not least is Michael Ybarra, who's the Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Advocacy and Strategic Alliances at Pharma. And all of them are involved in one way, shape, or another in this fight to end cancer. So I'll go in the order in which I introduced you and ask you for your preliminary thoughts that you want to share with the audience. So Dan, again, thanks for being here. Where do you want to begin the conversation today? Just in
I think
60 seconds or so.
Yeah,
just tell us.
right. I think I'd like to start. I mean, I think it can be an uplifting topic, and so I've been involved in one way or another with kind of the cancer realm going back 20 years when I was doing research. But so when I look at it, I see that there's a lot of hope. We're at a place where there are a number of exciting technologies converging. I reflect on AI and machine learning, and we hear a lot about that, but I think when you think about cancer, this is a place where it can have a real big impact, and it is, both in terms of the drug development pipelines and sort of making those more efficient and more thoughtful, also in terms of decision making and treatment plans and treatment tools around patient care, and also around understanding and patient genomics and genetic backgrounds and overall patient characterization can have an impact both in terms of early diagnostics, early diagnosis, and also in terms of clinical trial design and sort of structuring endpoints, and just sort of across the spectrum, AI is a place where I think you can have a huge impact. Additionally, you're seeing, for example, on the immunology side, cancer immunology is huge right now. There are developments around tumor-specific targeting of therapeutics that together give us the ability to have really sort of targeted, focused therapies different from the cancer drugs of past. And additionally, on the genomics front, the amount of insight that we have now on human genomics and also the genomics around tumor biology and so forth really together put us in a place where I think we can sort of launch into a future of really innovative cancer therapies, and we're already seeing that. I won't say too much about the kind of policy issues and the IP challenges that we've discussed, because we've sort of gone through them in great detail. But obviously those are having an impact, both in terms of the way you go about protecting these kinds of innovations, but impacts on how we can fund early stage discoveries. And I think that's a place where our discussion will likely go today. So I think I'll just stop there and pass it on.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Hillary.
Yes, so I think I'll talk a little bit about Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and give you a little bit of perspective of where I'm approaching these issues from. So our organization is a dedicated cancer center. There are only like 10 of these in the country. So we're situated a little bit differently than some of the other community hospitals that are treating cancer. And to give you some idea of that, our physician scientists treat over 400 different subtypes of cancer. And so, Jean, you had asked, what's on the horizon? I mean, the fact that we now understand or have 400 different subtypes that we, say, this is the standard of care for this subtype. We've come a long way from when it was just, you have cancer. Our organization includes the Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Institute, where we have over 120 labs that are working on basic scientific research. And then we also have translational labs in our hospital that are trying to get those discoveries from the bench to the bedside. Our mission is to enable innovation with lasting effect both at MSK and everywhere. I'd say, I think Arthur had mentioned yesterday, most academic centers probably aren't filing a lot of INDs. We actually do have an internal IND apparatus. We sponsor our own clinical trials. We have gotten 11 products to market at this point, and hope for many more. And I guess some of the discoveries and breakthroughs that have started at MSK or started at some of our peer institutions, immunotherapy is entirely game-changing. Gene therapy, as Dan mentioned, cell therapy, CAR T, natural killer cells, B cells. We're modifying all of these things and giving them to patients. On the small molecule side, protein degradation is something that a lot of institutions are working toward. So there are really exciting therapies available, and then all of this in the context of really precision treatment, where you look at a patient's medical history, physiology, and the mutations, the genetic mutations in their cancer cells. And you really try and find, a personalized therapy regimen. We actually talk a lot about digital twins and how, our patients will come in and we basically build a digital twin for them and run different scenarios to see how their bodies will react to different treatments. So there are a lot of really wonderful things happening. I do think some of the policy things we've been talking about, and it seems odd, I think, to some people, and definitely people that I work with and doctors, we've heard about that the patent policy would play any role in that. But it does, and I think directly, we have a large patent portfolio that we invest in. There are things we don't invest in as much anymore. We don't invest in protecting diagnostics, for instance. So that is kind of gone by the wayside. And we also, I'll say that the Juno kite case, that was an SKI patent. So that has made our institution more wary of what we're filing and at what stage. And yet, at the same time, we want to promote academic freedom and we want people to publish. So I find a lot of my job is just catching things as they go out the door in terms of patent protection. I just say two other levers where I think indirectly some of this policy is going to affect us, and that is, and I can speak more about them, but initial funding of basic science research. We heard a lot about how the focus will change about what what drug companies are going to be interested in. A lot of our funding comes from sponsors. Again, I can speak more about that, but and then also the direction of clinical trials and what we invest clinical trial funding in.
Yeah, and I think Mike is going to talk to us a little bit about the realities of what it means to be in clinical trials, how you get into clinical trials, and what actually happens. But before I pigeonhole you and start peppering you with questions, I'd like to just give you the floor.
Yeah.
Say your initial thoughts, then we'll listen to the video, and then we'll go from there.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you and to meet both Dan and Hillary. So not too long ago, I was in medical school, contrary to what my kids say. It really wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. But when I was in med school learning about cancer, they taught us three things. Cancer was treated with surgery, chemotherapy, or radiation. That was sort of the way that you thought about things. That was how you grouped treatments. And when I learned about cancer, there were two big memories that I have from med school. The first was melanoma. Metastatic melanoma at the time, that form of skin cancer had a 99% chance of dying within 5 years, meaning it was effectively a death sentence. So that was a memory that sort of stuck out to me when I was in med school. Well, also when I was in med school, something promising happened, not related to melanoma, but there was a professor at Georgetown named Richard Schlegel who received a patent and was working with Merck on what ultimately became Gardasil, the vaccine against HPV. And if you know HPV, you know that HPV is associated with a variety of forms of cancer. So that was the first vaccine that really sort of took off and got approval when I was in med school that could actually prevent cancer, which was a really big deal. So fast forward a few years to when I was in residency, I remember taking care of a young man, 32-year-old man in the Georgetown ER who came in with stage 4 metastatic melanoma. And I was taking care of them, and I remember walking into the room thinking how depressing it was to take care of somebody roughly my age at the time that was likely going to die. And I took that impression into the room, and I walked out, I consulted their oncologist, and I sort of gave him that sense because that's what I knew. And they said, they sort of schooled me and they said, no, he's on a clinical trial, actually. You may not know about it. It was for an immunotherapy at the time that he said this patient had a really good chance of doing well based on the data that they saw. So it was sort of eye-opening, even just a few short years out of med school. I was in residency, that I was taking care of a patient that had a chance of doing well. That patient was not Jimmy Carter, but it's a really similar story to what happened to Jimmy Carter just a few years later. If you recall, he was 92 years old when he was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma. He was on Keytruda or pembrolizumab. And he's obviously survived from that melanoma. He's been able to live another decade. Obviously, he is at the end of his life now, but it's unrelated to the cancer diagnosis that he had about 10 years ago, and he benefited from that innovation. Fast forward to just a few weeks ago, I have a 9 and 11-year-old. They were in the pediatrician's office. They got their first shot at Gardasil, and that's a really big deal because kids their age are going to grow up and have the potential to live in a world where they don't have friends that get head and neck cancers, cervical cancer, different types of squamous cell cancer. So if everyone gets vaccinated with Gardasil that are their age, there's a chance that when they're my age, they're not going to have friends that have that really severe form of cancer. So I'm confident that with the progress we've made from diseases like squamous cell cancer, what we saw with metastatic melanoma, we can potentially apply that to other diseases that don't have the same level of progress. So you think about brain cancer, glioblastoma multiforme, you think about pancreatic cancer, areas that have significant unmet medical need, we can make that progress if we really stay committed to finding new treatments. So building off of what Dan and Hillary said, when I think about cancer now, it's not just surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. It's much more precise than that. It's personalized medicine, it's cell and gene therapy, and it's cancer vaccines. So it's really everything that was just mentioned. Personalized medicine means that we're able to analyze the tumor, so we don't just say it's pancreatic cancer. We're able to look at what types of mutations those cells have and identify specific types of therapies. Now, I'm an ER doc. I'm not an oncologist, and I can tell you reading the notes of the oncologists that have patients that come in through the ER, it is like reading IP law. It is so intensely complicated for an emergency physician. It is just as complicated as the world that you all live in if you're not an expert in it. And just looking at all of the mutations that we test patients for in order to identify what specific treatment that patient needs. That's personalized medicine. It's not just throwing the same cocktail of chemotherapy at a patient. Second, cell and gene therapies. That's the other huge area of innovation. Cell therapies is sort of harnessing patient cells to be able to turn on the immune system more effectively. One of the great mysteries of cancer is why our immune system doesn't eradicate it, right? Our immune system fights viruses and bacteria, but it is trained to turn itself off when a tumor develops inside the body. So cell and gene therapy plus immunotherapy is really trying to understand how we can harness the body's immune system to eradicate cancer. And then finally, vaccines. This is really exciting to me personally because of the story that I mentioned. Gardasil, which is a vaccine against HPV, has the potential to eradicate certain types of squamous cell cancer. But there are other vaccines that are being studied for treatment, not just prevention. So if you received a COVID-19 vaccine, chances are you received one that's mRNA technology. mRNA was originally studied and developed to be used as a treatment for cancer. And that's what we're sort of entering into this phase of now, where you can take mRNA technology, you can study a tumor, and then you can develop an mRNA vaccine to effectively prime your immune system to be able to target and fight the cancer. So that research is in development now. So cancer death rates have dropped tremendously, but based on your amazing introduction, it is so clear that we are so far away from where we want to be. I took care of a patient a couple of weeks ago that had cholangiocarcinoma in the emergency department, which is a type of bile duct cancer. There's really no treatment available for that patient now. And interestingly enough, there was an article just published a couple of days ago in Endpoints that indicated a company was deprioritizing their cancer research in cholangiocarcinoma because of the IRA. They were prioritizing a different cancer type because of the incentives that the IRA put into place. So that hit me really personally, not as personally as what you shared, but I could think of a patient that I had just recently seen that was impacted by this IRA, and there's not that same level of connectivity happening in Washington. There is this sense that we can have a cancer moonshot and we can totally undermine the incentives to develop new cancer treatments through the IRA. So I know that's what we'll talk about, but before we dig into that, we wanted to share this video that we created when we were in ASCO earlier this year with some of our members, and hopefully it'll trigger some of the questions that come.
What excites me about ASCO is really seeing the spectrum of new advances in the treatment of cancer, thinking about the impact that that has on millions of patients as well as their loved ones.
I always look forward to this meeting because it's a great reminder of how science is transforming lives. And in cancer, obviously, you've seen mortality gains down 33% since 1991.
There really hasn't been a time that I can recall in the last couple of decades where there's been so much excitement about the progress that's being made.
So far, we've already seen really exciting news about new treatment paradigms for certain types of breast cancer, certain types of prostate cancer. And what I worry about is the existing policy environment, what that's going to do to meetings in the future.
So we have 4, I think, major pieces of news coming out at ASCO. But importantly, 3 out of the 4 would be impacted by the policies of price setting in the IRA.
The Inflation Reduction Act, and specifically the pill penalty, will have a significant impact. It's going to distort which drugs we develop and how we develop.
You don't want disincentives for research. The IRA is disincentivizing investment, especially because of the small molecule provision.
You often want to use small molecule type medicines to reach a broad range of patients. These drugs take 5 to 8 years to even start to take off.
Incremental innovation is often how you find the largest benefit. A clock is going to be too short for many of these new modalities to be established.
When you look at each of these policies that's being pursued, they really, in a cumulative way, have destabilized the innovation ecosystem.
Over the last couple of years, some of these policy discussions have really tried to put innovation at opposition with access. And I really think that health policy can achieve both goals.
I think it's really important that we work to come up with better solutions that address the affordability and access problems that do exist, but at the same time does not impede companies' abilities to invest in future innovation.
Michael, do you want to tell us about your thoughts after that video, or we'll go back in the order we've
Well, I think what we wanted to do through that video and share with you all is that every year the American Society of Clinical Oncology hosts a meeting in June, and they talk about all the incredible advances that are happening in cancer, but that research is many, many years, if not decades, in the making. It's not just a clinical trial that wrapped up a few months prior. And so, the policy environment for the last 20 years is what led us to the meeting in June. And the policy environment that we adopt today is going to impact the meetings 5, 10, 15 years from now. So that's why we wanted to be on the ground at ASCO and sort of point out, again, the inconsistencies that we're seeing in the policy environment. On the one hand, we want to have a cancer moonshot, but we're sort of siphoning out the fuel that, feed the rockets that allow it to take off. So that was our concern, and that's what perspective we can share in the remaining 30 minutes.
Great. Hillary?
So I was thinking about, MSK, we're pursuing maybe about 2,000 trials, protocols at any given time. And, we had talked in our pre-call a little bit about how this affects cancer therapy, maybe more than some other disease areas. And kind of the traditional way to bring a cancer therapy to market is starting with, a smaller cohort of patients whose, survival time is shorter, or, it's like a fourth line treatment. They've already, been through 3 different types of treatment without beating it. And so I'm curious as we start targeting larger populations, right? Because that is where you can get returns on the investment. I guess my thought was, one, that's not great in some ways, because you're just not going to have as many clinical trials. There's not going to be as much incentive to put into this. But is it also potentially the thing that might kill the IRA when you have, this particular patient population where it is so specific, where you do have so many different subtypes of disease, and so many things that would be orphan designations, and more than one indication. I think Corey Salzberg mentioned that exception is only for one indication. It's a little bit more of a question about, and where I was finding a little bit of hope since our pre-call is
Right.
like, maybe cancer is the thing that actually makes the IRA unsustainable.
I think it's the most sort of obvious example at this point. I think over time it's going to be clear that it has broad impacts for everything. But you're absolutely right that the way we think about developing treatments for cancer today, the IRA timelines, which are completely arbitrary and effectively made up, will, change the calculus for the way that you invest in the timelines that companies have to put forward, because these it takes a long time to show difference in earlier cancer types. You're right. We tend to start cancer treatment, go for that initial indication in a later stage cancer, more advanced disease. You can detect a difference on a little bit of a shorter time horizon. And then once a drug is approved, the research continues, so you will do additional clinical trials. Some of those have a longer time horizon, because the earlier that you move in the cancer stage, the harder it is to show a difference over time. An early cancer, if you're going to show a difference in the patient's outcome or how the tumor is progressing, it's going to take longer to show that difference the earlier that it is. And of course, policymakers are putting forward a lot of plans and ideas to detect cancer earlier, but then we're sort of have the IRA on the other hand, which makes it harder to recoup investments for the studies that are going to ultimately show if we have treatments available. So we want to be able to detect cancer earlier. We also want to have treatments for that early stage cancer. So these things are kind of working against each other in our mind. And the concern is definitely that, right now you invest in later stages and then you sort of work backwards, and companies are having to reevaluate their strategy. Earlier today, we actually sent a letter to the White House making this point to the cancer moonshot. So that's why it's really top of mind. And it was good coincidence that we decided to do that at the same time. Maybe we could send it as follow-up to this group so y'all could sort of see what we sent. It's out in the public as of tomorrow. But that's definitely a concern, and that example that I gave of the Endpoints article with cholangiocarcinoma is really top of mind. But there are a lot of others that we've seen where companies are making changes to their R&D timelines as a result of this.
Great. Now, Dan, I have a specific follow-up question for you, but I'd like to, there's been a lot said so far. What reaction do you have? What do you want to share? What thoughts do you have before we dive into specific questions?
Yeah, I have a reaction kind of at the kind of broader level, which is that, right now we really need to be funding early stage research, both, academic level, research institutions and early stage companies. And particularly on the early stage company side, you're already dealing with an environment where money is scarce, investments are, investors are very risk averse. And I've witnessed as well that, IRA already coming up as sort of a question mark. Is this going to be subject to the IRA pricing schemes in diligence context? And so, people are paying attention, and I think you're going to see it kind of at the earliest stages, the impact of that. From where I sit, we're all going to go back to work, or I'll go back to work tomorrow and have to make decisions about what to file on, when to file. And, so then these sort of policy issues, we have to be aware of them in the world of sort of managing a patent portfolio and protecting innovations. But we also have to kind of move ahead. And I think, it just speaks to some of what we've been talking about more generally here, which is that there are these sort of shifts in the law, shifts in the patent law in terms of the way the PTO and the courts are applying the patent law. There are policy shifts that are going to have an impact. And, some of the things that we've been talking about and thinking about, I think the way we deal with it is to be, really diverse in the approach that we take to protecting things and being thoughtful about the way that we file. Here it's sort of really thinking about and factoring in how the IRA and this potential pricing scheme, if it continues on, is going to impact the value, and understanding how that affects the value proposition around companies and new innovations, and making sure that the filing strategies that we implement and the things that we pursue in terms of patent protection are really well aligned with that, in terms of setting up the right, the right positions around these therapeutics that at least, even in the current framework, are going to provide, the security that I think investors are going to need and partners are going to need to want to move things forward.
So that was actually where I wanted to go, I think, with you, and ask you what decisions your clients are making and how that has changed over, say, the last 10 to 12 years. We talk about not pursuing medical diagnostics. Well, if you don't pursue medical diagnostics, you're not going to learn what somebody has. You're not going to be able to treat it quicker or diagnose it quicker. And in this area, a quick diagnosis, it literally is the difference between life and death.
Yeah.
And, Myriad and Mayo have made that very much more difficult to do. And now with the IRA, so what changes of decisions are you seeing, both in the past and now maybe more recently?
Yeah, if you go on the 10-year scale, I think the most pronounced is probably stemming from Myriad and on the diagnostic side. 10 years ago, on any given week, there was something that was being considered around, sort of a new way of diagnosing based on some sort of expression profile and so forth. And there was a lot of a value assigned to that. And some companies were built on that principle of being able to diagnose early and were, generating, big Series A rounds around that concept. I have not seen that of recent. I think there's been a big shift there. Just in terms of filings, I looked actually in prepping for this, you don't actually see a huge decrease in the number of filings around diagnostics. You see a shift in the way that they're approached, but there's still a number of filings that are happening. And one of the things that we talked about, and I think Hillary alluded to, is that it's the value that's assigned to that has sort of shifted and gone down. And the emphasis, at least from a patent standpoint, is more focused on the sort of the therapeutic aspects. We're still filing on them, but again, the value has shifted, from that standpoint. One of the things that's really interesting, I think, from a patent standpoint, when you deal with personalized medicine, is that the product, you can't define it. It's actually specific, in many cases, to the patient. And so then you're left with, like, you take some of these antibody cases where you want to be able to define it based on a CDR and have a very specific thing. Well, with a lot of these personalized medicines where you're dealing with cancer antigens and, engineering cells that are directed at those antigens, it's really customized to the patient, so the product is actually a process. And then that raises a whole host of other issues, including issues around how do you actually go about protecting that in a meaningful way with that allows you to actually sort of enforce those patents without these sort of complicated divided infringement issues that can arise when you're dealing with multiple parties that are involved in the process. And so I think that we have to be really it's on the one hand very exciting what we can do with cancer right now and where we can go with it and the level of insight that we have, and it's just going to go up exponentially as we learn more about the genome and the epigenome and how it plays into tumors and then the tumor microenvironment and how we access that. I mean, there's just so much there. But it leads to, in this environment of the patent law, a need for really creative ways of protecting it and creating value for companies that allow them to kind of drive things forward. Because without that, there'll just be a stop and a shift to other other options. Because you won't be able to fund the work.
Yeah, if I could just say,
Go ahead.
We research diagnostic methods, right? We develop diagnostic methods. We just don't file patents on them, right? That's ultimately.
But what's the consequence of that? I mean,
I think the consequence is a lot of that stuff is used in-house, and other, similarly situated players can go look in the journals and they can see what we've published and they can replicate it, but there's no packaged product. There's no one out there who's taking it to market. And that, I think, is the difficult thing. It's, most of, I would say, most hospitals where people get their care are not operating with the state of the art.
So, and this is a situation where I've talked to a lot of inventors over the years, and one of the things that when they've invented something, they'll often say, well, and then after I've done a search and I found it, and oftentimes you can, with particularly independent inventors, you can find literally exactly what they've invented or within a couple degrees of what they say they've invented. They always come back to me and say, well, why is this not in the market? He said, I've looked everywhere for this. I would buy this. And it's, well, nobody can own the rights, and this is not trivial to make. There's a cost here. And the minute somebody makes it, if it's successful, you're going to have big box stores swoop in and lower cost, make it in China, bring it over, sell it for pennies, and they'll make money, and you won't because your costs are going to be higher. So without a patent or exclusive right, lots of great things that otherwise would be marketable don't exist. And this might be a good segue, Mike, to ask you to talk to us about the realities, scientific, financial, and otherwise, of going into clinical trials and what that means and what commitment that takes, and how it's really just not possible if you don't, with something you don't own.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great point. And also one of the reasons why there's no guarantee when you start a clinical trial what the answer is going to be. That's why we do the study, right? The accumulation of evidence is key to the way that we treat patients. We need evidence-based medicine in order to provide good care, and clinical trials provide that. They also provide information that's needed for regulators to be able to make decisions about approval. So it's serving two roles, but more importantly, that initial approval, that first FDA approval, the clinical trial for whatever that was that gets the drug on market, only provides a limited slice of information, and the continual accumulation of evidence over the course of the medicine provides a much broader picture about the way that we take care of a patient. So it's not just the stage of cancer, which is one piece that I think we've touched on, but it's other types of cancer. Pembrolizumab or Keytruda just had another FDA indication, I think even this week, which is really, really important because we need to know, what patients, what stage, what type of tumor, before or after surgery. All of that requires having evidence and knowledge, and you're not going to invest in that unless you have a product that you can protect, and if you have a reimbursement environment that rewards that accumulation of evidence. I get asked all the time by physicians, why aren't we studying X generic drug that's been off the market for 50 years? Why don't we know if this works better than this other generic drug? If it's not the government that's studying it through one of the NIH grants, there's not that commercial interest at that point. So it's a frustration, I think. And I think what I take away from that is not that, it is mostly that we need to continue to incentivize the development of products that are on the market, and that's why the IRA is concerning, because it's putting in place these arbitrary time frames that sort of cut it off right when it's just sort of reaching the peak, I think, of knowledge, particularly for small molecules, because 7 years is such a short period of time in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. Midostaurin is a good example of Novartis's Rydapt. Off patent for many years, the composition, and then identified as a great therapy for hematologic malignancies. So, surprises.
Yeah. So, Dan, I mean, how much of a consideration is this end part for clients on the front end? Are you seeing real changes in what they're innovating, and not just with respect to what they're patenting?
Off the IRA, I'd say no, because we're still pretty early on that. I mean, I think the idea of looking ahead at LOE and what's going to drive, the value on the other end post-launch, that's always front and center and part of the plan for developing a patent portfolio. I don't think this changes that. I think probably it might ultimately, you'll see the impact in terms of what companies are pursuing, whether it be a shift to biologics, which seems to be an apparent shift that will happen fairly soon, and already maybe to some extent has happened with some companies that have portfolios where they can kind of make the shift.
See, let me just pause there, because I don't get that. And maybe it's I just don't understand the industry enough, but it strikes me that the goal is to be able to treat people with a pill, that doesn't need to be refrigerated, that they could take once a day or once every other day or once a week. It's not, the gold standard is not, the ultimate end gold standard is not to force everybody into clinics where they need to get infusion once a week or once a month.
Yeah, I mean, I think putting IRA aside, I mean, biologics, in terms of personalized medicine and cell-based therapies and antibody therapies, I mean, you're in that world anyway, and that's there. And I think a lot of the growth is probably going to continue to be there.
No, I mean, I get it, and I don't want to seem Pollyannish, right? Because I think biologics are very important. They're certainly a major step in the right direction of personalized medicine, but if you are trying to efficiently and economically and feasibly treat a large population, biologics is not the answer today, as far as I can tell. Am I wrong in that?
I think actually what I would say is let's just sort of follow the science on this. And in certain situations, a large molecule might be the best treatment option for a patient. In other situations, small molecules play a really important role depending on the cancer and where you want to target, right? And this gets to the science and are we following the science, or are we following arbitrary timelines that legislators made up sort of as we were approaching this reconciliation deadline? Small molecules play a really important role. There are a variety of other factors that you just mentioned, like the convenience aspect of it, the access issues that it poses to patients that are not in New York City. They can't necessarily get to Memorial Sloan Kettering easily. Patients that are maybe in rural areas that might benefit from small molecule treatment options versus infused therapies. But I actually think both are really important at the end of the day for physicians to have sort of a cadre of options. Things that are targeting intracellular targets, others that are targeting extracellular options. Biologics can be used, monoclonal antibodies, those are going to be, big proteins. You need big things and you need little things. To me, you kind of need the full array. And you don't want to really put the weights too much on either, and the IRA just, in our mind, put so much more of an emphasis on the large molecule, and we want to create parity so that they're both closer together.
Yeah, no, I that's exactly what my feeling is, and I guess where my questions are going. And I also find it ironic, like when you're talking about different treatments for different diseases besides cancer, one of the things that the advocates who want free drugs, break patents, give everybody the latest, will point to is, well, what's available to be in generic form is something you have to take 3 times a day or 5 times a day on a strict regimen. It needs to be refrigerated. It needs, et cetera, et cetera. Right? What we want is the end one that's easy. It's extended release. It doesn't need to be refrigerated. Take it once a day or once a week or whatever the case may be. That's what they want. But it seems like when you look at the IRA, it has totally changed that whole argument on its head. You're forcing people over the short term until the science catches up, I think, to by and large need to go with regimes that are harder to keep, more inconvenient to keep. That's not what healthcare is supposed to be about today, right?
Yeah, and there are a lot of things at play. I think Arthur could probably speak a lot about the healthcare costs and how they're skyrocketing. I think that an example, and this is kind of getting us a little bit off track, but certain regulatory requirements in terms of what needs to be given in a hospital setting versus not, also restrict us. There are injectable therapies that, for instance, can be used to treat prostate cancer. It's the same drug as what women take, I think, for some of their, for fertility treatments. But, a person with prostate cancer has to go into a hospital to be able to get that injection. So there are a lot of things at play here.
So what's the... Oh, we have a question. Go ahead. No, you could just yell from there. It's fine.
So it's a selfish question, but I want to go back to Michael's point in the beginning about the IRA diverting research from cholangiocarcinoma. And I was hoping you could elaborate on why that is. My selfish reason is I lost my best friend 3 years ago to that cancer. He was diagnosed in April, died in December. And it was just so fast.
Yeah.
So to hear that resources are being diverted away from research for cancers like that, I'm curious what it is in the IRA that's doing.
Sure.
So the question is about a specific type of cancer that you mentioned. If you could remind us what that is, just so people watching this on the tape will get it. And go ahead.
Yeah, so the IRA has price setting that goes into effect at different times for small molecules versus large molecules. Small molecule price setting goes into effect at 9 years for small molecules, 13 years for biologics. And the clock starts on the price setting, different from the patent life, which you all are experts in. The price setting begins at the date of the first FDA approval. Now, the kind of current development, sort of traditional development of cancer treatments is to start in smaller patient populations in a later stage of cancer. But if you start in a small patient population, your clock starts then. And so the thinking has been of companies is reprioritizing R&D plans and clinical trial plans to start with a larger patient population so that your clock starts in terms of IRA price controls in a larger patient population. So you would, all else being equal, do you start small or do you start larger? And that's what companies are starting to take into account as they are creating their R&D plans. The example that I mentioned was a small company that is developing a molecule, and they had 2 options basically. They could pursue, as a small company, they could only make one decision, right? They couldn't pursue both for resource reasons. They could pursue a clinical trial in cholangiocarcinoma, or they could pursue a clinical trial in breast cancer. And all else, prior to IRA, they likely would have started in the smaller because they could get an answer quicker. But in this case, they decided to pursue the breast cancer indication. It'll take them longer to get an answer, but the clock starts on price setting with that larger patient population. And they feel that there will be a lot more indications that follow, but they want to start with the largest patient population they can get at this point in time. So that is sort of the thinking. We've heard that from other companies that are not maybe speaking as prospectively as that, but they're looking at their product portfolios retrospectively saying we would have done this completely differently had the IRA been in effect in 2010. So Genentech CEO made some public comments that were captured in Stat. He indicated for one of their products, they started in ovarian cancer. They would not have done that if the IRA would have been in effect at the time that they launched that product. So that's the rationale that the sort of IRA layers in a complexity that impacts R&D decision making.
And it's not to say that we don't want to study treatments for breast
No,
cancer.
no.
It's just that it's a lot easier to move forward with smaller populations, a lot more cost effective to go through the clinical trials.
To
right?
get the first indication. Yeah.
And that economics now changes based on when price setting would fit
Correct.
in, because you can't make money doing this with small populations. You make money doing it with larger populations once it gets approved, and if that back end is going to be cut off, you can't start with it small. And how often is it, if you know, where something starts with a small population study and then winds up down the road realizing, well, no, this has greater application to much more common cancers.
Yeah.
Is that common?
I think that's a standard.
That's the norm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a standard today.
Right.
And also you think about, just the gold standard of treatment, right? Like I was thinking about a comment that was made yesterday in terms of, how much time it takes to get doctors comfortable with a treatment.
Absolutely.
And in cancer, we have gold standards for all these different types of cancers. And so for someone to, for a patient or a doctor to say, I'm going to forego the gold standard to try something that's going to be different, especially at an earlier line of treatment, an earlier phase of disease, that's going to be a really tough sell.
Yeah.
Just,
Arthur, go ahead.
It'd be interesting to do this in a more sophisticated kind of quantitative way, but the history of the biotech industry is littered with companies that failed because they tried for an overly broad initial study. Our new anti-cancer treatment will treat this entire class. They run a trial, it either fails or FDA knocks them out and they're toast. Whereas the companies who went narrow band had a much more likely path to success. So what you're saying might also have this very unfortunate consequence of many more firm failures.
Yeah. Well, and I think you brought up Keytruda being, I think, just got a lung cancer approval, right? But there have been a lot of Keytruda failures
Absolutely.
too, right?
Absolutely.
So if they had chosen, and I can't remember if it was breast cancer or what, but if Keytruda if Merck had pursued Keytruda for the wrong indication, done.
Yeah. And these studies are very expensive to set up. They obviously, they take patients wanting to be a part of the clinical trials, which is huge, but they're very, very expensive. And I just can't emphasize enough how going in, you really don't know what's going to happen. You don't know until you get the results at the end of the day if it's going to be positive or negative, despite the best kind of evidence going in. We know a lot, but there's a lot we don't know also. And one of the most challenging parts about being a physician is that everybody, every body, every biology is complicated and acts in really unpredictable ways.
Yeah. So what is the happy story here? I mean, I guess we're in a much better position scientifically than we have been in the past. That's for sure. The question, I guess, what we're struggling with are all the progress that we've made over time, are we about to forfeit them and push people in directions that the science may not otherwise have led them out of different incentives based on price fixing? And we don't need to relitigate the negotiation issue, but let's just remind ourselves, the government calls this a negotiation. It is not a negotiation. It is no more a negotiation than it is when the mob boss tells you, you're going to do this. Because if you don't take the government's offer, you're penalized, as Corey pointed out yesterday, in their one drug situation, it'll be a $45 billion fine. And that's for saying no. So these are not punitive fines. These are ruinous. These are bankrupting fines. It's not a negotiation. So people are going to behave differently, right? I mean, and what is that going to mean? And I think, Michael, we talked to you said nobody really knows what this is going to mean. That's the problem, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on a positive note, I am, I'm always sort of positive about our ability to continue to innovate. And so I think, so long as we don't backslide, I think one thing we didn't touch on is that there are politicians that want to take it further. And so I think we have to stand our ground now, hopefully make it a little bit better so that we don't lose out on the progress. But, we've seen tremendous advances, 33% decline in cancer mortality because of, better diagnostics, better lifestyle, and better treatment. And so we have to keep focusing on those things if we want to move forward.
The better diagnostics and the better treatments are the part of that triad that are really problematic here based on the IP incentives, and that's what is depressing. And it's having talked to some cancer researchers who are doing this for all the right reasons. These are people that are not getting rich. These are people who are dedicated in a lab trying to help people. I think the good news story is that those people exist, that they continue to want to do good, and they're going to try their damnedest to do good. If the system would just get out of the way, I think we'd be in a much better position. In the last few minutes that we have, I'd like you all to wrap up if you can. Your parting thought. What is the thing that you hope people leave today remembering? We'll let Hillary lead us off. Then I'll have Michael and Dan, since you went first to begin, I'll give you the final word of the panel. So Hillary. Nice.
I guess the thing I would like people to take away is that academic medicine is not immune to the larger issues in the bio life sciences ecosystem. And in fact, might be a place where we see some of this, have an effect earlier. And I do believe, Gene, that we are going to keep researching and innovating, and because so many people are touched by cancer and have lost loved ones, there'll continue to be philanthropy. It might not be as much as we would like, but there are a lot of people who are dedicated to dedicated their lives, their careers to fighting cancer, and so it's not over. It's still going.
Yeah. Great. Thanks a lot, Hillary. Mike.
Totally agree. Just to reiterate the points I made at the beginning, cancer when I was in med school, which wasn't that long ago, was surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. Now we're talking about personalized medicine, cell and gene therapy, and cancer vaccines. And I think you're right. Like, we'll find a way to innovate, but I think we all need to be aware of the sort of threats and the continued pressure on the ecosystem, and work together to push back on things getting worse and try to make it better.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And Dan, final word.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a promising time in terms of the technologies converging around cancer therapy and the potential there. I think, for companies that are managing patent portfolios and making decisions about how to prioritize different programs in view of IRA and other changes in the law, I think, to some extent, I'd maybe sit tight on things that are being tabled versus just, completely turned away from, and kind of see how things evolve, and there may be some life that comes from that. But more generally, I think when you're looking at portfolios, to really kind of keep your eye on the ball in terms of where the value is, factor in IRA and other aspects, and sort of continue to just be really deliberate about building diversified portfolios that allow companies to allow you to adapt to kind of these changes, in time, because, the life of the patent is 20 years, and a lot can happen between now and then. You want to kind of be armed for, for how things evolve.
It's a great conversation. My final thought is that I have no doubt that we're going to innovate. I have no doubt that there will be innovation. The whole purpose, as Abraham Lincoln explained, of the patent system is to incentivize people to innovate faster, to stoke creative genius with the ability to own what it is you come up with. And the point of the patent system is not to allow for innovation to happen on its own pace. It's to provide the incentive so it happens on our pace, the pace that is meaningful to us. And I don't want that to be lost. And I hope that in this particular issue has to have touched everyone's life. I mean, it has to have. And if it matters to you, then get involved. You know, whether that's calling your member of Congress or writing a letter or whatever the issue, however you can be involved. Because I do think that this is an issue. You know, we are at the. It seems to me to be at the cliff's edge. You know, looking into a future where we could walk across to an era where we have beaten most cancers and on the way to beating all cancers, and what's standing in the way is bad policy at the moment. Mm-hmm. So do what you can, get involved, and champion innovation. And I think that's probably the best way to end. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.